بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين والطاهرين ورضي عن أصحابه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وما بعد، رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي واجعلي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي أشدد به أزري. أما بعد، رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي واجعلي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي أشدد به أزري. ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك. صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Thank you for your patience. And you can excuse me for some of the side comments. Please, no more. And inshallah, we'll start now. And very sorry about the late start, but if need be, we may start the next night's session at 11:15, which may work better. So we'll make that announcement tomorrow night, inshallah, if we have to. So inshallah, the outline for today's talk again is probably to give maybe a 5-minute review of what we discussed, and then maybe a guided meditation. We'll try to keep the guided meditation short so we can cover some of the topics for a little bit longer. I'd like to, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, finish this introduction to the Qad al-Himam, excuse me, of Ibn Ajiba, his commentary on the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, and then inshallah bi'idhnillah begin with and then continue with inshallah 1 to 2 or reflections upon the first 2 to 3 Hikams in the with the framework of the commentary of Ibn Ajiba, inshallah. So that'll be the intention. Let me see if I can improve some of the lighting. I think probably the lighting's all right, but inshallah. All right, so let's begin. So let's actually just start with the guided meditation, and then we'll just move forward. I think that's just it's a better way to do this for those who are on, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So for tonight's guided meditation, the intention will be to, we're going to use the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, in the meditation. Hadia, come out please, and there's an echo. If you could take that outside, honey. All right, thank you. All right, okay. All right, I'm sorry about that.
Bye-bye.
All right, inshallah, so what we will do is, I'm just going to say a few words about the Shahada and how it can be used as a form of meditative invocation in Islamic spirituality. There's many ways to actually use the Shahada, and the Shahada is the essence or the very the essential methodology of the remembrance of God that's used. There's a very famous hadith which is often cited, a hadith of the Rasul, of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is cited, and it's a Hasan, it's a Sahih hadith that speaks of Sayyidina Ali asking of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to give him a means of approaching God, or give him the best invocation that will procure most directly a realized nearness of presence with God. And more or less, that 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 is the phrase, or those are the words used by Sayyidina Imam Ali, radiallahu an, karamallahu wajha wa alayhi salam. And the Prophet ﷺ then states that the best of invocations, and for this intention, is La ilaha illallah. And the exact words in the English, translating from the Arabic, is actually, please give me the direct path, the direct way, or the most direct way unto realizing God's nearness. And so the Prophet ﷺ then states, invoke often La ilaha illallah. And the hadith continues with Sayyidina Ali asking the Prophet, please show me how to do this invocation. And this is precisely where the spiritual practice of talqeen comes from for the early Sufis. That is the transmission of the dhikr of Allah, the transmission of a form of invocation of the remembrance of God. And so it is precisely in a hadith like this where precedence is taken for such a thing, that it starts with the Prophet ﷺ himself, who gave a form of invocation to, among his companions, among the most choicest of his companions, and in specific from his from his family, from the Ahlul Bayt. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he smiles and he says that I'd like you to listen to me recite La ilaha illallah. And he asks, and in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ states, be silent and listen as I invoke La ilaha illallah 3 times, and then I'd like you to recite the invocation La ilaha illallah, and I will listen as you recite it 3 times. And this then constitutes the essential framework for this practice, this traditional practice called talqeen of the Dhikr itself, where the murid takes an invocatory practice from the teacher, from the Shaykh. And so, in effect, the Prophet ﷺ made Ali silent and then repeated La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. And then this was then, after it was received in a state of presence and in a state of silent meditative listening, it was repeated by Sayyidina Imam Ali, and he then recited it out loud. And this then became the foundational transmission method of taking a tariqah or a particular wird or particular formula of the remembrance of God from a teacher. So it's a very beautiful hadith for these reasons, and also for the content of the hadith itself. Both in regards to understanding that La ilaha illallah was deemed by the Prophet ﷺ to be, in terms of invoking it, the most direct approach to realizing the presence of the divine nearness. And then the very methodology of the recitation was outlined in practice. So it's a very beautiful, comprehensive hadith of the Rasul ﷺ. And the La ilaha illallah, this particular shahada, can be used in many ways in Islamic spiritual practice. Among other ways is to understand in the grammatical that in the shahada itself, in La ilaha and illa Allah, there are 2 essential parts. The first part is what is called the nafi, or the negation. La ilaha, there is no God. Illallah, except God. La ilaha illa Allah. And so the second part is affirmation, the ithbat, affirmation. So, only after negating, spiritually speaking, do we affirm. What are we negating? We are negating all those things in our heart that are obstacles and veils and which clutter the space of our heart from God's presence. So we are negating those things and emptying them with the help of the invocation of La ilaha illallah through the nafi, the negation for any object of attention and any object in your subtle subconscious or conscious, in your consciousness, embedded as a trace of an experience stored in your heart that is other than God. The more attention that you give those things in spiritual practice, they then become the things that you, uh, in a sense, worship by giving them attention. And if the heart is meant to know purely God's presence, then all these objects of perception have to be emptied, and the process of releasing them is through this invocation of La ilaha illallah, with the negation and then affirmation of illallah, except God. There is no God, no object of attention, or no object embedded in my heart, no content of consciousness embedded in my heart, no thought or sensation or feeling, emotion embedded to negate them except for God's presence, right? So La ilaha allows us to empty and wash all the effects of our actions and our thinking and our feeling upon the substance of the heart, so that we can affirm God's oneness, his presence, as always being present in the heart. For if we claim to be muwahhids, or those who believe in the pure oneness of God, then our heart, our spiritual heart, should be reflecting it in some way. And so then the process of purifying our hearts from the effects of the conditioning of the nafs, of the ego self, is through that polish that the Prophet ﷺ also spoke about, which is the remembrance of God. La ilaha illallah. In his case, La ilaha illallah. And it serves by its very structure or spiritual anatomy of its vocabulary and its grammar as a most opportune means, and in the prophetic description, the most direct means unto attaining a, a realization of God's presence, of nearness, of our heart presence with God. So, what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to enter a state of silence where we return or rediscover our heart presence in some way by some conscious attention to the heart. I'm sorry, to the breath. And once we are more comfortable and more relaxed into the silence of the heart, we will then use the help of the shahada to continue emptying the heart and affirming God's presence in the heart. And as we then at that moment say La ilaha illallah, feel free to use this kind of movement where we move forward and we are almost in effect bowing and negating kind of all that which has cluttered into the heart, La ilaha, and then coming back, illallah, and affirming God's presence, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. So we'll start with a silent meditation first, with conscious attention to the breath. Bismillah. Take a deep breath in and out. And one more. Deep breath in and hold it and out. One more breath and out. give some attention to the sensing of your breath, and feel free to do a 4 on 4 on 4 and 4 count. What I mean by that is this: in the in breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, and as you reach the peak of that, hold that breath at the peak for another 4 count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then as you exhale, another 4 count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you reach the end of your exhale, another 2 to 4 count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Feel free to use that internal counting to gather yourself a bit more and enter the silent spaciousness of your heart. Bismillah. With each in breath, stay present. With each out breath, surrender unto Allah's already present presence. Bismillah. With each in breath, feel your gathered sense of presence. With each out breath, relax and surrender unto God's presence. And as we feel now, bi'idhnillah, a bit more relaxed into our gathered sense of a center, of the heart center, of our heart presence with Allah, we will begin a 99 to 100 count of La ilaha illallah in the way that I mentioned. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. La ilaha illallah. 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 لا إله إلا الله 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 سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And now, only for a few moments, with each in and out breath, simply notice the quality of the silence of the heart and your presence of heart, your presence with God. Bring some attention to your heart, to the very center of your being, and notice the quality of this center, your conscious awareness, now, in distinction to what it was prior to the invocation of La ilaha illallah. And stay with this. Notice how certain thoughts or feelings, or perhaps the effects of certain actions have been emptied, have been washed away. All that which is other than God has been emptied in your heart by the polish of the dhikr of La ilaha illa Allah. And in this, try to feel God's awareness of you through your heart. And feel the clarity, the transparency, even the purity of God's presence through your heart. Bismillah. And now make an intention that we, in some way, as we continue listening to this talk, that we remain heart open to receive all those intuitions and modes of guidance that Allah wills for us, that God wills for us. Bismillah al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Thank you again for your patience. I know we started a little bit later than the 11 p.m., maybe 11:15 or so. And if that is the case for tomorrow night, we'll just simply state that we're starting 11:15 or 11:30. This naturally begins to happen as we continue in the itikaf experience, and as at the time of the breaking of the fast is a little bit later, and the time of Isha prayer and the Tarawih prayers are slightly shifted here in the Zawiya, and then for some of the friends to relax a bit and rest after a long day's worth of silence and meditation and solitary invocation and or self-reflection and reading, and or walking inside of the Zawiya and inside of the basement facility while invoking and reciting the awrad or the virds. After a while, this is taxing on the body and on the mind. And so thank you for your patience, those who are online and those who may receive the recording, inshallah. So by way of very brief summary in 1 to 2 lines, we are discussing Shaykh Ibn Ajiba's his introduction to tasawwuf, or Islamic spirituality, or Sufism, as a sacred science of Islam. And he divides this in his 15-page introduction to defining Sufism, to relating or discussing in briefly its subject matter, or in other words, what does Sufism deal with as a science. And then he discusses the founder of Sufism in the Prophet ﷺ, and discusses the origins of the name of Sufism, and this is where we left off. So by review, in terms of how one can define Sufism, we highlighted the saying of Imam al-Junayd that Sufism is that the real, or God, makes you die to yourself. In other words, to your sense of separation from God's presence, and to live by Him and His presence. This is the meaning of Sufism in a nutshell, that it is that the real makes you die unto yourself and live by Him. In this context, there have been many definitions of what Sufism is. some of the awliya have said that Sufism is character. So the one who has the best character is the one who is best in Sufism, and so forth. There's many other. Sufism is divestment. Sufism is adab, courtesy before God and courtesy before the creation of God, and so forth. There's so many variegated definitions of Sufism that have been provided over the years by the authorities, especially the early authorities, that that sometimes they appear to contradict each other. And a famous scholar and Sufi saint from the 1600s, Sayyidi Ahmad Zaruq, or the 1700s, he states that all of these definitions come back to one phrase, and that is sincere attentiveness in the heart towards God, or simply sincere attentiveness or sincere directing of our attention towards God. And that everything that has anything to do with this is Sufism, and that in fact every definition of Sufism comes back in some way, shape, or form to this essential meaning of Sufism, in the context of Islam's, in the Islamic understanding of how to be sincere towards God by, of course, following the commandments of God. But this element of sincerity is the essence of Sufism. What one could say is one pointedness of attention towards God, and to do anything and to do anything for the sake of God, and to simply be with God in all of your external conditions and internal states, to be with God. So, in regards to the subject matter, he states that that the subject matter of Sufism is the divine essence itself, and it is, of course, therefore, the most sublime kind of science, because its object or subject matter is the most sublime reality in itself. For the Sufi is the one who seeks God, and purely for God's sake, and seeks only God, does not seek knowledge for knowledge's sake or status or anything like this, but purely seeks God in their living, in their wayfaring, in their practice of their religion, in their self-reflection, and in their interactions with other human beings. They seek only God's presence. This is Sufism. He also states that this is related to the very subject that is seeking God, and this would be the essential selfhood of the human being, which he distinguishes in terms of nafs and the spiritual heart, so the ego self, and the heart self, or the qalb, the spiritual heart, and then the pure spirit, the ruh, and that all of these modalities of the subject, the human subject, is also the subject matter of Sufism, in that these are sought in the seeking of God to be refined, so that they become a locus of awareness of God's presence. And so he lays this out very beautifully. Then, in terms of the founder, of course, he states that the founder of the science is, of course, the same founder of every Islamic sacred science, and that is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That Sufism as a reality, even if it didn't have this name, goes back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, just as the other sacred sciences, which did not have those names in the time of the Prophet, go back to the Prophet, because he was the founder of them, and he in some way, shape, or form participated in the functioning of those sciences, whether it was rhetoric or grammar, even in terms of in balagha, he spoke beautifully, he spoke logically as a prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In regards to the madhabs, he conveyed a methodology of arriving at what God wills in a particular situation, which of course came from direct revelation, but also what he was inspired with in terms of actions, etc., etc. And this relates to purification of the heart self, of the inner self, for God's sake, which because of the point that the heart of the human self is made primarily to know God. We just did a guided meditation on La ilaha illallah and brought our attention to our heart self, to the center of our being, that is our heart. And through this, we may have felt an emptying of that which is other than God, that's embedded in our heart, in the subconscious, and in the center of our being that clutters us by all the thoughts that we have, or all the inclinations or the desires that we have that are other than God. And we affirmed God's presence in our hearts by La ilaha illallah, by the negation and the affirmation of the Shahada itself, that there is no God but God. So this is an example of what Tasawwuf is trying to do as a method in regards to making our heart center more transparent before the divine presence. And then we spoke about last night the origins of the names, and I won't go through them. And so I'd like to move on now to, but mentioning that safa, or impurity, is one of the most authoritative understandings of where the word Sufi or tasawwuf comes from, as well as the term safa, or as in the Ahl Safa, who are the people of the veranda, or the people of the bench amongst the companions, who were deeply into contemplation around the time of the Prophet ﷺ in the mosque of Medina. And interesting enough, although this mosque has expanded, this beautiful Masjid al-Nabawi, there is still a kind of veranda that's there, or this opening, a canopy-like an opening, right before you enter the road of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one can even imagine that it's very possible that this original courtyard may have in some way served this function for the Ahl Sufa who sat here from amongst the companions, chief among them being the likes of Abu Dawud al-Hifari, who was very contemplative and ascetic in his spirituality, and who sought God's presence by contemplation, by meditation, by by always being in a state of worship, of ritual worship of God, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are among the origins of the names that Sufism or Tasawwuf, or the term even Sufi, derives its origin from, as these terms arose in the tradition a couple hundred years after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this earthly realm. But I wanted to make this point that, of course, the very founder of Sufism is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that with him and his spiritual presence is the essence of Sufism. All right. Number 6, in terms of the description of Sufism as a science, he speaks of the legal ruling. What is the legal understanding, or the understanding on the level of the outward sacred law of the fiqh and jurisprudence in regards to this science of Sufism? And he states that Imam al-Ghazali said about its legal ruling that it is an individual obligation for every Muslim, i.e., it is a fard ain. Since apart from the prophets, peace be upon them all, no one's heart is free of an illness, of a spiritual illness, or of some kind of defect. His point here is also, and as implied in our earlier discussions, that for one to fully apply the sacred law and some of the obligations or the commandments of God, one has to exert some element of self-discipline upon oneself, in terms of, for example, not backbiting. And if we refrain ourselves from backbiting, we are really doing the inner work of cutting ourselves off from any sense of arrogance that we might have, or any sense of malice that we might have towards other human souls. And so a lot of that is the inner work. If you do not do the inner work of purification, then these habits will still abide. And the only way to reverse this process, or to stop it, is to reverse or wash away these blameworthy qualities or traits that we find in one's mind and heart. That inner work is none other than spiritual purification. And so this must therefore be an obligation to some extent and on some level for the believer, for the sincere believer. In other words, every sincere believer or every believer, it is an individual obligation that they strive with or they learn some element of purification of their nafs, in order to conform to the commandments of God. And on this level, Ibn Ajiba states that tasawwuf is the heart of the sacred law, as we have mentioned, and for these reasons. Now, obviously, from this point of view, this is one level of Sufism. It is a very general level of Sufism, of Islamic spirituality, that is meant for every believer. Right? Then there's a more specific form of Sufism for those human souls who will wish not just to purify themselves to obey God's commandment and to enter paradise in the hereafter, which is a most important and very beautiful intention, and an intention that is an effect of a sincerity of faith. There are those seekers who wish to go even beyond this, and they seek God here and now. This is the Sufism of tariqah, of a more particularized or specialized modality or relationship with this particular science. In other words, these kinds of seekers, they seek out a spiritual teacher, a master who has, by God's permission, attained unto or has been bestowed with, with mastery, spiritual mastery of themselves and of their living of the religion with their heart presence. In ihsan, living the religion with prophetic presence and with spiritual excellence. And this is really the station of ihsan. The starting point of tariqah is the station of ihsan, in which the Prophet ﷺ stated that in ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarahu, fa in lam takun tara, fa innahu yarak. That ihsan, or spiritual beauty or spiritual mastery or spiritual excellence or spiritual virtue, is that you worship God as if you see him. And if you do not see him, verily he sees you. It's this heart orientation. It's this as ifness. I'm praying with presence of heart with God. And this presence of heart with God is being with God as if I see him. And it is the very prophetic definition. And so cultivating this sense of heart presence with God's presence is the very starting point of this station of ihsan. Whether it is the latter aspect, which is us just simply being mindful that God watches us, which is the beginning of Muraqaba, or if taqwa and Muraqaba, or it's the first part of the definition that you worship God as if you see him, as if you're spiritually witnessing God's presence. This being a stage higher than Muraqaba, which is in mushahada in Sufi terminology. This relationship or connection to or enactment of Sufism is, as one can see, a bit more specialized, a bit more particular for those souls who have this, this deep intuition or yearning, this shok, this irada, to seek God here and now and to seek God's presence now. That they're not content only with knowing that they will meet their Lord in the next life. They wish to somehow meet him as if they're meeting him here and now, as if you see him ka'annaka tarahu in your worship here and now. And so this constitutes a more specialized or restricted, if you will, by the nature of things, interaction with or enactment with or connection to Sufism or Islamic spirituality, which specifically facilitates the seeker entering a relationship, a spiritual or initiatic relationship with a spiritual teacher, which is often institutionalized or codified into frameworks of tariqas or Sufi orders. Although the term tariqa is still a general term, but is more specific in distinction to Sharia, which if the Sharia is the general sacred law that all Muslims have to abide by, and that is meant for all. Tariqa is a specific way unto approaching God and realizing His nearness. And the more one comes upon this path, the more one realizes that one needs a teacher, and an engagement in spiritual companionship and a connection to the teacher. Oftentimes taking the form of halqeen that we spoke about in the guided meditation. This connection where a transmission is made of the litanies or the invocations in the presence, or somehow with the presence and the permission and the blessings of the teacher. So it is a fard ain for everyone, but then I just spoke about a specific aspect. Abul Hasan al-Shadili states that anyone who does not immerse themselves in this science of Sufism will die persisting in grave wrong actions without being aware of it. This is a bold statement, but his very point is that one is not giving God their proper due when one is worshiping. For if your mind is all over the place and you're going through the motions, and you feel you've fulfilled your obligation unto God, you are really ignorant of what God really asks of you. He essentially asks your whole life and your whole being, your heart, to actually be present in that prayer. For your heart to actually be present in the prayer, not only does it take profound faith and sincerity, it takes a lot of practice. And this practice is and of course interaction with those who have attained unto this heart presence with God in prayer, to interact with them, to receive a spiritual transmission which facilitates that. And so one can see the statement of Shaykh Abul Hasan al-Shadili that in fact one would be very ignorant in reality if one does not have a share in this science, in some element of spirituality. For religion without spirituality is an empty shell, and spirituality without religion cannot last. So the both need each other very much, like the body needs the soul or the spirit to actually live, and very much like the soul or the spirit needs the body to be embodied in this realm due to its subtlety. So both are needed, the Sharia and Haqiqa, and their meeting is Tariqa. Right? We defined these terms earlier. The sacred law and the divine reality, and their meeting is the spiritual way or the spiritual path. The meeting of sacred law and the divine reality. All right. And let me then now move on to subsection 7 of understanding Sufism's parameters. Understanding its parameters involves knowledge of its technical terms and the words which are used by the people of Sufism, such as ikhlas, or sincerity, a term that we've been using for this whole program, and sidqa, truthfulness. I also use that term once or twice. Tawakkul, or reliance. Zuhud, doing without or some form of divestment or detachment, or even asceticism. Wara, carefulness with practicing one's religion or scrupulousness. Rida, contentment, which is considered a state or a station upon the path. Being content with God's pleasure and with God's presence and with whatever occurs in one's life as it has come from God. Taslim, submission or surrender. Muhasaba, love. Fana, spiritual annihilation of the ego self. Baqa, subsistence of God's presence in your inmost self. And words or terms such as that, the divine essence, which was used already, and sifat, the divine attributes, qudra, the divine power, hikmah, the divine wisdom, ruhaniya, spirituality, and in bashariya, in mortality or the human nature. Hal, as in spiritual state, which are transient states which occur in the practice of Sufism. They're almost like inrushes of the spirit, which open one's heart, and one may have a state of expansion or contraction, which are considered states. What are more talked about are those states of expansion and ecstasy, but there are also states of contraction that occur and are deeply spiritual. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, when he received revelation in the cave Hira, the angel Gabriel squeezed him first. And then he was opened onto the expansion of revelation. Terms such as maqam, or spiritual station, a kind of standing at for example, I used the term contentment. We can have spiritual states of when we're content or happy with God or pleased with God, and we can be on the station, and that nothing wavers us in the obstacles of life, from the station of being fully content with God's decree in our life, whatever occurs, the good of it or the bad of it. Warid, or spiritual inspirations or intimations that arrive as insights into one's heart, especially in the context of a person or a seeker who is in a constant state of spiritual remembrance of God. Their heart may be open to intimations or inspirations. These are waridat. These are the intimate. This is the intimate dialogue that one has, the subtle dialogue that one may be privy to in Islamic spirituality due to the heart's awakening, due to the remembrance of God, the constant, repetitive remembrance of God, which awakens the heart. And we'll say more about that when we use, say the Aisha al-Ba'uniya's text, inshallah, and so forth. And so these are terms which then define in many ways the parameters of what the Sufis are talking about. For any science, one needs to know the technical terms that they are using, whether it's fiqh, right? And what is meant by, for example, chaos or analogical reasoning. What's mentioned by terms like qat'i, or authority, or the authoritativeness of a particular matter, and so forth, right? For example, in usul al-fiqh or in usul al-hadith, or the science of hadith, what is meant by a weak narration or a strong one, who is grading these, right? From mawdu to sahih, right? Who's creating these, not just that they're categories, but then which authority prefers or recognizes one hadith with a particular chain as mawdu for a particular reason. Right? I'm just using technical terms in those sciences, right? And so the point is to be familiar with that science. One has to understand the technical terminology. In the science and art and practice of Sufism, Islam spirituality, one can learn these technical terms by spiritual kind of dictionaries of Sufism. So you have this in an example is, of course, the same author. Ibn Ajiba has a very beautiful book on these terms. So you also have earlier works like Imam al-Qushayri's his Risala al-Qushayriya that does the same thing, brings about many technical terms of the Sufis, and he defines them very clearly. And to have an awareness of the science, one has to understand the technical terms being used and specifically how they're being used. So, for example, the term mushahada, which means spiritual witnessing. In Sufism, mushahada simply means to witness or bear witness, which, of course, for the shahada would mean to bear witness that there is no God but God. That's technically from the point of view of the sacred law. You're verbally bearing witness. This is a shahada, but mushahada is considered an inner, internal spiritual state in Sufism, where one is witnessing God's presence in some way, right? Or witnessing the signs of God by seeing an inner meaning of something occurring in their lives in the very moment that it happens, which is a kind of inner communication from God to the human heart. This is a spiritual witnessing. Right. So, and so forth. So that's just an example of how the term, mashahada has one general connotation, and then also has a very specific one in the science of Sufism. Going on to 8, degree of excellence. Here, he mentions that, as mentioned earlier, the subject matter of Sufism, of tasawwuf, is the divine essence, which is by definition that which is most excellent. It follows, therefore, that the science of it is also by definition the most excellent, since its subject matter is the most excellent, the divine essence. In other words, if we speak of the sacred law, right, the sacred law and its subject is very sublime. Or let's speak about more specifically in terms of the sacred law, the science of fiqh, of understanding how to arrive at the divine commandments or the injunctions or the divine will, what God wants us to actually do. How do we arrive at that? What does God actually want us to do in a particular situation? This is the realm of fiqh, right? It's deeply practical, but based on the revealed sources, on the revelation itself. But it's not simply black and white, because we're taking from the Quranic verses that sometimes can be ambiguous, and we're taking from the actions and the statements of the prophet that oftentimes and almost every time have a particular context and may not necessarily be applied to every situation. So how do you do this? How do you go about this? This takes there's a whole methodology involved in arriving at what does God actually ask of us in this particular kind of situation. So arriving at to the best human extent possible um, the preference of the divine will in a situation. That's fiqh. That's very noble, but this has to do with human actions, right? And the divine injunctions. It's very noble, but it technically, from this point of view, is not as sublime as the subject matter of Sufism, that is purely the divine essence. Bearing witness to in some way, or tasting, or I don't want to use the word tasting too strongly, realizing in some way, appreciating the divine essence. Right? If, from a purely spiritual sense of the sacred law and fiqh, deals entirely with the divine acts. The science of Sufism deals with the divine attributes, this like not just the afal, but the sifat, and especially the that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For when you are purified of your own selfhood, can you somehow bear witness to the pure oneness of God's essence, his selfhood, right? And so the ultimate subject matter in Sufism is simultaneously the most purest, inmost essence of the human consciousness, which somehow is mysteriously connected to the divine essence. Right? And so there's nothing more sublime than that. This is the point. And I hope that makes sense. And then here's a very beautiful example of a statement from some of the Sufis regarding the excellence of this and the excellence of even simply knowing how excellent the science of Sufism is in Islam, because not everyone appreciates Islamic spirituality in this way. So he states here, and oftentimes Islamic spirituality may be entirely reduced to psycho-spiritual purification, some form of Islamic psychology, or simply psycho-spiritual purification. This is a part of Sufism, but it's not all of Sufism, as we just mentioned in terms of the sublime nature of the divine essence and the essence of human selfhood. Right. So this Shaykh Thaqali says in his work, Anyone who believes in this spiritual science is among the elite of the believers. In other words, anyone who has an insight into the importance of Islamic spirituality, of ihsan, of tasawwuf, of Sufism, is already by that definition among the elite of the believers, that they have a special understanding that God placed in their heart. If they have a mere intuition that there is something in my religion that is this, that reveals or unveils or opens onto this science of purification and of spirituality. Anyone who understands it, now going beyond just simply believing in it, because there's people who believe in it but then may feel that it's not possible to find a teacher who can teach it, or that I'm not worthy of it. They simply have faith in it. This is a beautiful matter, and they would be considered among the khas, or the elite, or just those people of faith who have a very special understanding or a special belief in this. And they may not necessarily have an understanding of what it is. He goes on, anyone who understands this science is among the elite of the elite, meaning anyone who understands some of the subtleties of this science and what it really entails, and even having an intuition of how to have comportment with a teacher who transmits that science and that art of living. This makes them even more special because they have this beyond a faith in it. They have this intuitive awareness of its specialness, and they have been open in some way in their intellect and in their heart to understanding to some degree of the science and its underpinnings, its terminologies, or that these things are important. And anyone who is able to give expression to this science and is able to discourse about it is an inexhaustible ocean and an unreachable star. In other words, the one that God has opened their heart to the realities of Sufism, and that they are able to articulate its realities by speech and by their states. Such a one is an ocean of knowledge and an ocean of the divine presence. And may God preserve them. May God increase them. May God allow us to benefit from them. Ameen. Ya Rabbal Alameen. Okay. Someone else said, if you see someone who has had the belief in this path, in the tariqah aspect of Sufism, and opened unto him, congratulate them. If you see someone who has an understanding of this, and some of its intricacies, then envy him, because he's been given a special knowledge. Have a positive kind of envy of him. And if you see someone who has had articulation and the inspiration to communicate this science, then honor them greatly. But if you see someone who criticizes this particular science, stay away from them. And he says, and to flee from them as you would flee from a lion, makes the point. There is no science that cannot be dispensed with at some time or another, except Sufism. There is never a single moment where it can be done without. That's a very beautiful statement. His point here is that there's certain circumstances where you might have learned a particular detail of sacred law that only applies in particular contexts. So that knowledge is not necessarily needed all the time. One can do away with a particular knowledge, right? Or particular condition, or particular, to use a terminology, the furu, or a particular aspect of the branch of the roots of the sacred law, that in certain circumstances they may not apply. So even if you did not know that knowledge, you can do away with it because it may not be necessary in every circumstance. He says the only exception as a sacred science as a whole is Sufism, for in reality, you can't do without it at all. You always have to be aware of it if you wish to be sincere with God. If you wish to be sincere with God. All right. So that's a very beautiful way to speak about the excellence of Sufism, and so you see already how there's this there's sense of awareness uh, of just really kind of indicating how excellent, how ahsant this, how ahsant in ahsan is, how excellent spiritual excellence is. And so Ibn Ajiba does an amazing job of this. He then, the second to last subsection, he says Sufism's relationship to the other sacred sciences. In terms of his relationship to other sciences, Tasawwuf encompasses them all, and indeed is a precondition for them, since there can be no knowledge or action without sincerely turning towards God. In this way, ikhlas, sincerity, is a precondition of all the sciences. For you can learn, for example, how to pray by fiqh manuals and by someone who teaches you how to pray. But if you do not have sincerity in your prayer, then your prayer, going through the motions, will most likely not be helpful at all. May not even be accepted by God if you have not cultivated sincerity. And to cultivate that really is to be present, to the extent possible, for the entirety of the prayer, because you're in front of God, or God is in front of you as you pray. God is paying attention, and you're praying for God by a means that He sent. And if we are all over the place in our minds, then that prayer lacks presence. If it lacks presence of heart and mind, if it lacks mindfulness and heartfulness, and even bodily presence, bodily awareness in the postures, then it lacks sincerity. And if it lacks sincerity, then what good is it in terms of being accepted by God? Do we want a very minimal acceptance, or do we want a more higher form of acceptance of anything that we do for God's sake? This is none other than Sufism. And this is an example of how Sufism is needed and is in reality a precondition, or the heart, the essence or the root of any science, and that therefore the science of Sufism in its own way encompasses all of the sciences, even if the other sciences are important to express and embody Sufism more completely, right? The Sufi who doesn't pray in the way that the Prophet brought, it's difficult to actually call them a Sufi, because they're really not following the Prophet, and they're not following the divine injunction to pray in a certain way. If one's heart is pure, there can be exceptions, but I'm giving a stark kind of contrast here. This demonstrates the interrelationality. So you have Islam and Iman and Ihsan in the Hadith of Jibreel, right? What is Islam? It's the 5 pillars. What is Iman? It's the 6 articles of faith. What is Ihsan? It is to worship God as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, verily He sees you. All of these dimensions of the religion are interdependent. And if you are insufficient in one, if you lack one, then your practice of your religion in a holistic sense is lacking. So, of course, there's an interdependency and interrelationality, but the heart encompasses them all. The heart has precedence. Coming back to the hadith of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, of course, the heart being the science of Sufism, and our heart orientation to the religion. Coming back to a particular hadith, that there is a part of the body that, if ill, or if sick, or if deficient, the whole body is ill. And that thing is the heart. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he gives in precedence to the inward of a thing, to the heart, in regards to the body itself. So he gives this particular example. And so one can then apply this to religion, that there's a part or dimension of religion that, if deficient or lacking, then your religion is lacking. And that would be the heart dimension. And that is the very point of why, Ihsan, as a science of Islamic spirituality, or as spirituality, Islamic spirituality as such, is essential. to the religion and to the practice of the religion, body, mind, and heart. Okay. In terms of the benefits, the final section, and we may end here because I think I'd like to start with the hikam hopefully tomorrow night if I have the energy, and I intend to have the energy hopefully inshallah to be idnillah if God allows, and we will attempt to. So I want to give the hikam its proper due, and inshallah, I will spend the entirety of tomorrow night on a few hikam, or at least one to two, and they will be a very inshallah comprehensive analysis, of those aphorisms, inshallah, based on the commentary of Ibn Ajiba, inshallah. I promise you, inshallah. And so this final section on the benefits of Sufism. The main benefits of tasawwuf, are refining the heart and gaining direct knowledge of the knower of the unseen, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or you could say that its benefits are bringing about generosity in the self, peace in the heart, and good conduct towards every creature of God. Here we have what the real benefits are, right? If the benefit of learning fiqh or applying or practicing the religion is that your actions are accepted by God, the real benefit of Sufism is the refining of the self, really having a proper methodology and arriving at real purification of the self to awaken the spiritual heart so that it may know God by direct experience. This is the benefit, and one could say here the goal of Sufism, to actually know yourself and thereby refine yourself by the practice of the religion, and so therefore to awaken the heart in its spiritual journeying unto the divine presence, so that the heart, your inmost essence of consciousness, may know God directly by direct experience, by tasting, by dhawq. And we return here to the hadith that we started with in the guided meditation, where Imam Ali asks, please communicate to me the most direct approach to gaining the nearness of God. And the Prophet ﷺ said, practice the invocation of La ilaha illallah abundantly. And then Imam Ali asked him, please show me how to do this. And we are all in debt to Sayyidina Ali for asking him that. And then the beautiful transmission of the invocation of La ilaha illallah that then becomes the foundation for the spiritual teacher to initiate and to transmit a particular formula of remembrance or a particular litany to an adept or a seeker. And so therefore, the very goal of Sufism is knowledge of self, and thereby intimate knowledge of God by direct experience. And this process entails not only a refinement and purification, but essentially or ultimately a kind of spiritual annihilation of the ego self, that principle or that reality inside of us that seeks to live more or less autonomously and separate from the divine reality, the Nafs. So the annihilation of the Nafs, of the Nafs, and the subsistence of the Ruh, or the spirit in us that communicates the ever-present living reality of God. And I'll end with his final paragraph on page 15. Know that the knowledge which we have been talking about is not a matter of rattling off words. Know that the knowledge which we have been talking about in terms of the science of Sufism is not a matter of rattling off words. Rather, it is a matter of dhawq, of tasting, spiritual experiencing, and which then ecstatic experience. It cannot be acquired from books, but only from the people of tasting. So he really hits on this point. Just like we had mentioned that one who is a lover of martial arts or of any kind of art can only learn the art from a master of the art who has embodied it and made it second nature and is able to skillfully communicate and teach that art to the particularities and the idiosyncrasies of the particular aspirant of that art. In that same way, the discipline or the science or the art, the sacred spiritual art of Islamic spirituality can only really be learned in the presence and in the companionship and through the guidance of a spiritual teacher, a spiritual master of that science. One, and to be a master, one who has tasted God's presence and knows God intimately by direct experience. And these are, the foremost of them are the awliya, but these are the shuyukh of this science. These are the shuyukh of tariqah, of Sufism, and any that they appoint to help others on the way. It cannot be obtained by talk or tale, but only by serving men of Allah and keeping company with the people of perfection. And God alone grants success to those He grants success through their keeping company with someone who has been granted success. So we're very logical and profound that the only way to receive this realization or to be open in your own heart to an intimate awareness of God that is abiding and transformative is to connect to yourself who has done this journey and has arrived at tasting and has arrived at this this grace of God by the bestowal of God. Allahu Ta'ala alam, and God knows best. And thank you for your patience. We will end here, inshallah. I pray that that was helpful. That concludes this minor introduction in regards to Ibn Ajiba's text on more or less what is Sufism or understanding tasawwuf as an Islamic sacred science. If there's any comments or questions, I welcome them now, and feel free to type or chat in. Feel free to do so. And I'll give a few moments or minutes for that, and we will end, inshallah. And thank you for your patience, as we did start a little bit later than stated. And I hope that this was beneficial for those who were present or those who will be listening to the recording, inshallah. All right. Anything? Was that understandable on some level? Alhamdulillah. All right. We will end here. Thank you again for your patience. In barakallahu fikum. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're very welcome. Your Sayyidah.